Good morning, everyone. Please note that in accordance with the town's procedure bylaw, no decisions are to be made, but rather this is a meeting. This meeting is an opportunity for council to have informal discussions regarding the various matters. Today's workshop is with respect to the Code of Conduct, and we'll be receiving a presentation from David Nitkin. So I'll ask Andrew Brower to provide us with an introduction. Andrew?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning. Mr. David Nitkin is here from the firm EthicScan. He's been involved in this term's review of the Code of Conduct, and today Mr. Nitkin will review some of the key themes and questions that Council will need to think about in terms of moving towards a final draft, which we hope to do by the end of this year or early next year. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Nitkin to facilitate it.
David?
Slideshow up here. Perfect. Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, councillors, senior staff, thank you very much for allowing us to make the presentation this morning. In starting, I'd like to acknowledge the help we've had from Andrew Brower, from Sarah Neisen, and from Lisa Lyons in having the presentation ready for you this morning. This is a workshop where you're going to be having an opportunity of looking at three sets of documents. First of all, we're going to be going through a presentation. Then we're going to be taking a look at 5 or 6 pages of tables, which is literally the kitchen sink of everything that we think you might want to consider and evaluate in terms of revising the code for elected members. And then third of all, we have a much more substantive 30-page document which will form the basis for a lot of text changes and detailed edit comments that we are proposing.
Mm-hmm. David, if I may, housekeeping matter, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. So, the mayor has started to say that this is not a decision-making forum, and that's the most important element of this morning's discussion. This will be a very wide-ranging, substantive discussion of everything that our firm was able to gather and assemble in terms of comments from senior staff, comments from you as elected councillors, comments from a public participation process, comments from other integrity commissioners in the 38 different municipalities that have an integrity commissioner, as well as comments in terms of best practice from an organization of which I'm a member of, which is an Association of Integrity Commissioners of Ontario. So I have not stinted. I literally have said I have a choice of throwing everything at you, including the kitchen sink, or not, and I've chosen to literally do that. But if we're going to be dealing in such a wide-ranging way with literally everything that might be reflective in a code, we've done so with some judiciousness. What we've attempted to do is to clarify what are some high-order questions that you need to answer, what are the kinds of things that are routine text changes of tweaking a word or two, what are the kinds of things that really belong in the code versus what belongs in a policy, and if education is so important, if a number of you said, I'm not sure I know what's in the code, or I don't feel comfortable fully with understanding what conflict of interest is, or I have some questions related to some of the legislation, how can we better inoculate you and make you feel comfortable not only with the letter of the revised code, but also its spirit? And so a significant part of what we're going to be doing this morning is laying the groundwork for you to ask any questions of any kind related to the gamut of issues we're going to be talking about, so that you have a clear understanding of what it is might be a very good code and also some areas of choices, because I'll be perfectly candid and say that there are some controversial topics where I don't think it's fair to say there is a demonstrable best performance. There are some choices you're going to have to make, and staff is waiting to hear, and the public is waiting to hear what choices you make, but they're your judgment call. And on those issues, I'm going to be clear and say that's a choice you need to make. I can answer your questions about who does what where and why, but there's some choices you have to make. And so we've set the presentation up this morning into 4 kinds of recommendations. Those things, primarily 3 in number, where you need to make choices, and that's where we're going to start the dialogue and the discussion. Then a number of principles of good governance. Then we're going to be talking about the whole atmosphere and the whole transparency and accountability framework, and what kinds of information some of you make available on a routine basis, such as gifts, that in other jurisdictions more people have responsibility for that routine disclosure. And to give you a sense of how the world is changing, because the province is reviewing its current municipal legislation. And then we want to talk about some communications channels. It's no secret to many of you that social media, the ability to be able to attest to a code of conduct electronically are different ways in which people are communicating, and we want to thoroughly explore what those options and opportunities are so that you can make the best possible deliberation after this council session on the some 40 different items that I'm going to be bringing before you today. You're encouraged to stop me at any point in time for way of clarification. We're also soon going to be getting into looking at literally 40 different topics. And given that we don't have the time in 3 hours to look at all 40 topics, there will be an opportunity this morning where I'll be looking for this, which says, okay, I personally feel we need a timeout on this issue. There are 39 other items to consider. We can come back and revisit it if there's time this morning, but we have 40 different items to go over, and let's make sure we cover them all. So we're not interested in everybody saying everything they want to say on every topic because there are just too many topics that are available. The biggest ones, the greatest choices are at the front, but there are a lot of important issues down to the very last item among the 40 we'll be dealing with. So you do not need to speak on each and every topic. This would be an ideal opportunity to make notes in the margin as we go through the table document, the 7-page table document about the ones you want to circle, that you think in follow-up, these are ones that are important to me or ones that are less important to me. So, the process. We've asked for thoughts and inputs from the public. We're trying to develop a robust state-of-the-art code of conduct for elected officials. This is phase 3 of a 3-part process. The next slide will talk about and crystallize what those 3 parts are. And what we're trying to do is to focus on what are some key critical content choices that you need to make. What are the texts and approaches that are being used in other jurisdictions to be able to cope with these challenges? And most important, I've taken the liberty of saying you not only want in one pass to have the best possible code, but you also are sophisticated enough to understand that some things do not necessarily need to fit in a code to still be important normative behavior. And you're interested in looking at what kinds of things better fit into a policy, what kinds of things better fit into a guideline, and then we're going to introduce some new concepts to you. We're going to be talking about value statements. We're going to be talking about integrity tests. We're going to be talking about question and answer manuals. So as opposed to a fixed code, this is actually an opportunity for your integrity commissioner and or your CAO to post comments that reflect, this is a question about ethical practice. It's not covered in the code. I'm going to actually provide some guidance and advice in a proactive fashion. This is the height of leadership change and best practice in other jurisdictions, we're going to throw it all at you this morning so that you're aware of what are the complements and the supplements to a code, because not everything that should be in a code is in a code, and not everything that you want as normative practice necessarily belongs in a code. So, a review of the process that brought us to here 4 months ago. We started out, we did 1-hour interviews with every single senior staff person. We did 1-hour interviews with each member of council. And I insisted on the opportunity of meeting with 2 representatives of the Staff Association because they have a vested interest in this area, because the relations between town staff and elected officials is a very important one and is sometimes a cause for concern or discussion in debates of this kind. So phase 1 was 2 full days of interviews as listed. Phase 2 was an open public meeting where we had members of staff and members of the public come out and raise questions and concerns on 6 topics that we defined as being interested and more important to the deliberation process that we were involved with. We got more people that commented by way of email and telephone call than we actually did have come out to the public staff meeting, but this was a full reflection of the citizens who participated and the councillors and staff who participated of their interest in this area. And people were very keen to give us reference material on certain code practices, certain conflict of interest definitions that were in their leadership roles as a community-based organization. This is phase 3. This is where for the full morning you have opportunity to raise questions and topics and issues, not to vote, not necessarily to express your opinion on every issue, but to feel comfortable with you understand each of the nuances of all of these 40 topics, and you have a sense of where they fit in terms of your own priorities and the needs of your constituents. I'm hoping that the decisions today will update the roles of the Integrity Commissioner, will clarify your roles and responsibility as a councillor. I'm also hoping that it'll provide good guidance in terms of what is best practice in decision-making at the municipal level. I've tried to address every single public staff and councillor input that I could. Some were deleted as not being relevant, but I think the number that we have here is an attestation of the fact that we're looking at a broad range of improvements or enhancements. We've identified best practices where they exist, and we've already said that we're interested in looking not just at a changed code text, but also other ways that you can reinforce good behavior. So, for example, many of us think we've heard about an integrity test or a smell test or a sniff test. This is a concept maybe 20 years old. I'd like to think that EthicScan actually was the first one to employ it. It was done with an employer in this region. And what it was a statement which said, you can have a 40, a 50, or a 60-page code, but what about if an employee feels that there's something wrong in their head or their heart and they don't know what to do? You're not going to consult a 40 or a 50-page code. What do you do when you've got something that seems like an ethical dilemma? Well, that's something that's called an integrity test. And in this particular employer, in the communications business, the sniff test was, how comfortable would I be in explaining the decision before the old man? I don't mean this in a sexist way, but the old man happened to have been the founder of the firm. He was in his 80s at that time. He was one of only 3 people in the world that got the Pope's Award for Corporate Social Responsibility. And the old man was the conscience of the organization. And so if you could go in and you could explain what you were trying to do to the old man and he understood it and felt it was proper and appropriate, that reflected the culture of the organization. So that's a small family business, which is now a very large national business of 12,000 employees, but one of the biggest companies in the country, now called ExxonMobil, also called us in for an integrity test or a sniff test. And ExxonMobil said, we've got a 600-page code of conduct. But we have developed an integrity test, which is it fair? Is it honest? Is it reputable? And if it isn't one of those things, I, as the most junior clerk in the organization, can say, we don't do things like that around here. Okay? So it's empowering everybody, from the most junior person to the senior, to say, yes, we've got a code, but here's a quick fire method, not about whether the color of your tie is blue or red, but on something that doesn't feel right in your head or heart, this is how you might choose to treat this. And so that's something called an integrity test. It isn't in the code of conduct, but it's something that we have as one of the 40 items that we're suggesting to you this morning may be an empowering tool for you, for staff, and for others that are appointees to agencies, boards, and commissions. So we're throwing all of that at you with the idea of, are there different ways that we can enhance sensitivity to and reinforce ethical decisions? An important consideration here is, I know you've hired us to give you a code, but I'm hoping you come out of this process this morning over the next 3 or 4 weeks when we finalize this code, that in effect we've given you process enhancement. In effect, what we've said is there are a number of ways that you can revisit the code, whether it's updating it on a regular basis, whether or not it's finding other mechanisms and means to reinforce its principles through that integrity test, through an ethics question and answer process, which is an updatable code. There are all kinds of ways that we hope you'll come out of this morning's meeting saying, he's really been talking about process. And what are the ways that we can ensure, beyond an improvement in the text of a policy statement, that we actually have more robust understanding of what our ethical principles and decision-making criteria should be. And that includes the important area of ethics education. We're also keenly aware that you know and participate in the province's review of the existing legislation. So the last item on this page makes the point that the province is reviewing all of the municipal accountability legislation. We've shared with your Chief Executive Officer what our presentation is, what some of the submissions were from ethics professionals, but it's hoped that you and the region are both participating in that process in terms of making it more relevant and useful for you. What we're going to be looking at today are first 3 major choices. I'm estimating that each of those choices might take a good 15 minutes of questions and discussions. We're then going to look at a number of housekeeping items that, in combination, EthicsScan and staff feel are important to raise to a new level. We're going to be looking at a number of specific text changes, and then a number of important areas that we call parking, which is the legitimate tactic of saying, we don't have to make a decision now. Some of these are things that are important, but we don't have to make a decision on them in the next week or 2 or 3. We can actually say there are mechanisms to be able to address these, and I'll discuss what some of those mechanisms might look like. We'll also be talking about new language. There's several new definitions, including public trust, including non-pecuniary conflict of interest, that don't currently exist in your documents that we're going to be proposing, all of which is to say that we have every reasonable expectation that before the end of the calendar year, you should be able to say, these are the things where we've provided the text and the substance of decisions, so we have a new code, and these are the kinds of process recommendations that we've accepted from EthicsScan that will inoculate us against conflict of interest and inoculate us against improper decision-making. So, we have a table of 7 pages that I'm going to be getting to once we're through this slide, in which we're going to be covering these 40 different topics. Some of them are going to be referenced as code of conduct material. Others will be approached in terms of a change for policy. We've already talked about this notion of a smell test, an integrity test, or a sniff test of a particular kind. We've talked about commissioner guidance statements. But I want to talk about that now, even at the risk of preempting. One of the most important aspects of an integrity commissioner for you is ask before you act. So ask before you act means, aside from just asking an integrity commissioner to investigate a complaint, the legislation allows you to get the best possible use out of an integrity commissioner. You can go to your current appointee, Bob Swayze, and you can say, I'm thinking about this particular dilemma. Can you give me written guidance? The beauty of that is, number one, you don't have to accept his recommendation. Number two, he is beholden to make it available without your name attached as a piece of guidance for every other counselor. But third of all, you're fully free to know that whatever decision you make, he can't change his mind. So that's a very powerful tool, and one of the things we're trying to do here is to say to you, we would like to encourage you to ask more questions of your integrity commissioner, because in doing so, you've got guidance. You don't have to follow that guidance. It's guidance available for every one of you, and the integrity commissioner can't change his or her mind after the fact. So we're calling that an ask before you act culture. That doesn't mean that you're not capable and competent to be able to find your own counsel, but if you have a question, that can be an effective use of an integrity commissioner. We've already talked about the ethics question and answer manual. I will be recommending a number of topics as something that you may want to be able to have the integrity commissioner, in cooperation with your CAO, put in the form of an online ethics manual. Maybe it gets done once in the first year and twice in the second year, or maybe there's a flurry of 4 or 5. But if you have a question that's more detailed than the code can cope with, or something that the code doesn't even address, you can get an instantaneous answer that will guide you in terms of your behavior. A very powerful tool that you have. When I interviewed every one of you in the first phase, some of you said, I don't know necessarily whether I want to sign off on the code. And I'm going to be making a presentation, one element of the 40 of which will be that's not acceptable any longer, that a code of conduct is something that in most jurisdictions is mandatory, and you have to acknowledge and attest to your understanding of the code. You don't necessarily have to agree to abide by it, but you have to claim that you understood that every opportunity was given to you to understand what it's about and to understand its principles. So that we're calling an attestation statement or a sign-off, and we're going to be having that as one of the 40 items. One of the most controversial areas in many municipalities is on the question of social media, and we have a number of specific recommendations to make for you there. I think we've covered off all of the items here. We're going to be talking about not only pecuniary conflict of interest, which is financial, but beyond the letter of the law, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, there is a whole pile of recommendations from integrity commissioners and from judicial commissions, the Bellamy Commission, the Cunningham Commission, that have said that counselors must involve themselves and consider what are called social or familial or non-pecuniary conflicts of interest. And we're going to have an opportunity of discussing that so that you feel comfortable, that you understand what that involves. We're going to be talking about a routine presumptive gifts reporting and accountability regimen. It's my understanding that the mayor and the regional councillor are already reporting on gifts, but it is by far the common practice throughout Ontario municipalities that everyone that is a member reports on gifts asked for as well as gifts received. And so we're going to be recommending that kind of regimen here. We've talked about the ethics question and answer manual. We've talked about the asking before act concept. And one other one which will be new, which has been tried in some 6 or 8 organizations, regional and municipal governments. It's something called a Transparency and Accountability Committee of Council. It's been used to very great power and effect. What it says is one of the councillors will join together with somebody from the media, with 2 or 3 representatives of the community, with 2 or 3 others, which can include a member of staff, which can include a civics education organization, and things that may be process related that may actually enhance your application of accountability and transparency go to a committee of council which can meet on a regular basis. So instead of just saying it's something that we'll come to when we come to it, you can have a parallel opportunity for a committee of council meeting however often they meet, irregularly, to be able to deal with some of these substantive issues so that they're continually updated. So, we're going to get into the substantive part of the discussion. What I'd like to do now is to focus on the first of 3 choice topics. Each of these 3 will take a little bit of time. They don't require everybody's comment. They do require any kind of question you choose to make. There are no right or wrong answers here, but there are probably strongly held opinions. And what I'm trying to do is to elicit both sides of the choice spectrum so that we can make some intelligent decisions. These are the first 3 items that you'll see in the table that is now being handed out by Andrew. So the first one is family and business partners. It was something that came up in phase 1, which is, should the code for elected members cover the activity of spouses, relatives, and business partners doing business with the town? Many councillors were of firm opinion on this subject, and I think it was fair to say that the majority of you had some questions. What I think was the dominant feeling is, wait a minute, I'm elected. It's not my spouse or a business partner that's elected. Why should they have to be governed by some kind of integrity statement? Presumably, they can participate in public discourse as a separate individual. The problem is that there are serious considerations and concerns. All of the major judicial reviews that have been held in Ontario have dealt specifically with relations between family members and business partners. And I can tell you, in many, many countries in the world and in many other jurisdictions outside of Ontario and in the provincial and federal level inside Canada, this is a norm. That you need to begin to think about rules that not only govern you as a councillor or as a regional councillor or as a mayor, but also govern your spouse and your relatives. Indeed, it's a point of fact that in many jurisdictions, I'm not recommending this, but in many jurisdictions there already is the requirement that every councillor submit an annual statement of assets, income, and liability. Simply because the public generally perceives that you're going to be influenced by and influence your spouse or somebody who is a business partner that does business with the town. And so what I'm opening up as the first topic for your consideration is you need to give some feedback and guidance to the members of staff that are going to be making these changes, whether or not some of the recommendations that we propose need to be choice A or choice B. On this one, choice A is we're going to expand the language to include, to define and include spouse, relatives, and business partners, or not. And the people who are saying not are saying, I personally don't feel that there is an appearance of conflict. I don't believe that this would ever become an allegation of corrupt practice or personal consideration, and I don't have a problem with the current rules which are saying the code should apply only to myself narrowly. So I'm going to stop having presented choice 1. I'd like to encourage comments, if any.
Regional Councillor and then Councillor Vague.
I guess for myself, it's partially understanding. I've got starting to get a vague understanding, but perhaps seeing a couple of examples of other codes that do embody this would help, because I'm not sure what it means to recognize the activities of spouses.
Okay.
Does that mean to say, does that mean to say that, and is this mostly or all around, because at first this was around should the code recognize as opposed to conflict of interest, which are related but separate. And so I guess I'm not clear on what recognize could or does mean.
Okay. So what we are talking about is some specific language that would say there needs to be certain rules about acceptable or unacceptable behavior on the part of spouses or business partners.
So it might say, for example, I should not accept a gift over $100, nor should my spouse. Is that an example of what you're talking about?
That could be an example. A more credible example would be what relationship do you have to a spouse who might be the head of a community association and might be appearing before council and making a representation?
Okay.
Is he or she covered by this kind of legislation? Can he or she make a presentation? If she or he does, is there some conflict that needs to be declared? What if you have a business partner, is yet another example, who is doing business with the town? Does this need to be going to someone in that organization that is not directly related to you, that is not your brother-in-law or sister-in-law, that's asking for the right to be able to tender before the town?
Right, okay. So I'll keep my feedback short for now because it's still somewhat vague to me.
Fine.
But my general feedback would be to find as many ways as possible in the policy and the code to either daylight or limit us as members of council, or not limit, but set parameters on us as members of council, i.e., you must disclose any gifts to you or your spouse, or you must declare a conflict of interest if your spouse presents as a community group. I'd like to lean away from trying to set council-created rules that could reach out not only my spouse, but business partners, relatives, and relatives is yet to be defined. So in general, the idea of incorporating more of this thinking, yes, as much as possible through requirements or restrictions upon us as opposed to on other people outside of this who did not sign up for this job.
Okay. Other comments?
Councillor Vague.
My questions, and then I'll have a comment, are kind of along the same line. If, for example, a spouse sits on the board of some community-based nonprofit organization, and that organization, like most of them, would receive some benefit from the town. For example, they may have because it's a nonprofit organization, they may have a reduction in user fees, something like that. Am I supposed to declare a conflict on that, or am I supposed to tell my spouse you can't sit on a community-based organization in the town because your organization, you don't receive any direct benefit. The benefit is collective to all members, but I'd be recommending that you don't do these type of things. I'm really just not too clear on this at all.
Okay.
And especially when it goes to relatives and even business partners. You're telling business partners don't sit and advise this organization because they receive some sort of reduced user fee or something else from the town. So I'm really not, I think I'm in the same boat as John. I'm really not too clear on this at all.
What we're hoping to do in the legislation is get a sense of what it is your position. In other words, there is one position which says, I don't want this looked at any further. This is just a code for myself as an individual. I don't think that there is any potential or possibility of a conflict of interest. So when Hazel McCallion was reviewed by an independent integrity commissioner, $17 million later, the day after he submitted his proposal, which dealt with a business proposal from her son.
But that's not what I'm talking about.
No, I understand.
Here.
I understand.
That one's easy.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is a little more difficult,
Well,
and I guess we can discuss it more later. But it just seems.
I think what I'm trying to do is to position the comments and saying her response was that's one man's opinion the next day. And so what we're trying to do is to provide more clarity, which says this may be a potential concern. And understand there is language that's being proposed here that would clarify that you have the power to be able to act wearing multiple leadership hats. So we're not saying that your spouse or a business partner can't wear multiple hats. What we're trying to do is to provide education and guidance about what are the lines of appropriate activity or inappropriate activity, both appearance of conflict of interest as well as what might be logically perceived by a reasonable person to be a conflict of interest.
I guess my concern is that I think that this may be overly intrusive. I don't think that we're as big as the government of Ontario, government of Canada, or Mississauga for that matter. This is still a small town, and I think people know their activities, and so my concern is that this is over-regulated and this is over-intrusive. So my thought would be is I think most of us and most of the community knows what activities we have undertaken, and so regulating to that extent, I think, probably is overly intrusive in my concern. Regional Councillor?
Yeah, I'm still of the mind that I would like to see us go further down this road and understand it more fully. Maybe not going the step of trying to bind others through it, but as much as we can to wrestle with this whole idea of our relationships. Now, of course, pecuniary conflict deals with all of these pretty much in a way, but this is a little different. And the example we were talking about, I actually think it's a very good idea. I think, for example, my wife sits on a board that has and will probably in the future have engagement with this town. My feeling always, the reading of the conflict of interest legislation, and I may have misread it, but was that you should declare a conflict of interest on a pecuniary interest following either mother, father, or not brothers and sisters, but mother, father, spouses, children, or the inheritance line. And so, but I also read that as saying, there's been cases in municipalities where people, where councillors declare conflicts that aren't clearly defined by that act, and some people might think it's just to get out of a vote. And so I feel it's my responsibility to vote. If this kind of clarification can set a clear groundwork where I can say, no, I'm excusing myself from this vote on non-pecuniary issue, on non-pecuniary grounds, because I feel that my wife's passion and drive, regardless of the fact that she's doing it as a volunteer, could influence my decision making or be perceived to do so. I actually think I think that would be a very helpful clarification and would give a groundwork for somebody to say, I am going to absent myself from the decision. Whereas right now, I think it feels, sometimes when you go into that gray area, it can be looked at as you're dodging decisions. So again, and there's, I don't fully understand all of the different areas where this could work or not work or apply, except the one we just discussed, which is that one. But I think, then you get into, and then I'm with the mayor, if you get into like gift giving or gift registry and you start saying your business partner has to register their gifts or something, I don't know if we're going to suggest even that far, but that's getting a little probably intrusive into other people's worlds. And I'm not trying to hide anything. I just don't know how much we as government should be intruding into other people's worlds. And even the whole gift registry thing, I find I'd be interested to see how. I've never really looked at how it's done properly elsewhere, because I could see how that can get very tricky. I mean, you got in a small town, as the mayor says, so many friends and acquaintances, and they come over to your house at Christmas and drop you've known them since you were 16, and they put a gift basket on your counter at Christmas time. Do I got to go register that? So if we were going to go down that road, boy, I'd like a lot of education around it. Okay. But in general, I like the idea. Again, now I'm repeating myself, but a little more down this road, especially things that maybe put requirements upon us to either declare conflicts or to register things or to be more. But once we cross that step into asking others to maybe participate in that, I think we're maybe getting a little out of our reach.
Okay, I think we've covered this first topic. We're going to move on to the second choice area. I'll try and differentiate it from the first. And again, this is the level of discussion that we're trying to have, your comfort level with the language and with the concept. So, town versus personal events. The town has certain events which are in the name of the mayor or are in the name of the regional councillor, and conceivably can be community events which are in the name of an individual councillor. And so what I heard in phase one were some comments that said, this seems to be the occasion of complaints in the past. It may be an opportunity for more complaints, rightfully or wrongfully, in the future. Should members have their own events? Under what conditions do we assess them in terms of whether they occur regularly each and every year, whether they occur in an election year, when they might presumably give a certain benefit to the incumbent, or if they're genuinely for the town's benefit, about whether or not they might be considered being renamed, or we somehow or other change that ownership to reflect a name that's the town name as opposed to an individual position. So we're not talking about an individual, but we're talking about a named position on the town. So as the debate focuses in other jurisdictions, it's the question of, should the town have its own name? The arguments in favor, yes, this is clearly an opportunity for community leadership, for generating more support for avowed and acceptable community causes. There doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict of interest, and people have grown used to the idea that there's a legacy of these kind of important community projects. On the negative side, there's the potential misuse of town resources. There have been and there will be complaints about the use of emails or the use of staff time. There may be concerns about whether or not this provides an unfair bias for the incumbent. And if it's indeed a town event as opposed to an individual event, then would it be better not renamed as a town event? So I'm interested in comments here on this large-scale choice issue. Are there any thoughts or comments on the desirability of either position or approach?
Councillor Vick?
Thank you very much. You mentioned perhaps having these type of events renamed as a town event. However, there are a number of local events. For example, I do a Ward 1 community cleanup, and that does take some town resources. Been doing it for many, many years, but it is limited to the residents of Ward 1. I wouldn't call it a town event by any stretch. So I think this is, and quite frankly, this event is something that I created, and I'm the energy behind. And if I was no longer able to do it, it's not as if I can just turn it over to some residents and it would happen. It would die out in a year or two. But certainly people consider it a great benefit. But it is done in the community, and there are town resources used to make it successful.
Well, I'll chip in because everybody's aware that we do have the Mayor's Charity Golf Classic, and I think that if it's recognized as a municipal Mayor's Charity Golf as opposed to the Tony Van Bynen Golf Classic, I think the branding still does carry the municipal overtone to it, and frankly, it is for the benefit of the community. And my interpretation of the Municipal Act is that there is the expectation that the mayor would be engaged in promoting activities that are for the community's benefit, either social or so I think that if we get too strident on this, I think there's the opportunity of losing some good things that are happening in the community. I think the community sees and accepts the fact that there should be some things that we should be doing that don't necessarily fit within our regular mandate within staff. So I think that there needs to be an opportunity to exercise judgment, and I don't think that we've gone too far wrong to this point, and I think that the community has benefited by that. So I'd be supporting the fact that we would continue what we do. We recognize that it's the role of the mayor, not necessarily the individual, and that it's for a municipal benefit, and that's the intent. Councillor Kazans?
Thank you, David. I agree. I think that in trying to address a specific issue, we could potentially be getting ourselves too broad in this particular area, and so that would raise concerns for me too. At what point do I say that I can't hold any events for people in my ward, and we are in a ward structure here, so we're a little different than some other municipal councils who have chosen to organize themselves in other ways. So a number of us here do use town resources to hold events that are, I mean, they're open to anybody in our case, but are specifically designed to provide access to people in my community, in my ward, to town staff, to activities that might use town property. The difference is that for those kinds of events, they're not fundraising events for another organization, or even though those other organizations may be very deserving and community-based organizations and so forth. So I think that if we are going to address this at all, that perhaps we do need to put some parameters around events to define them as fundraising events, because otherwise we're all using town resources for things that benefit our specific communities, and I think that to inhibit that would be really, in some ways, denying people an opportunity to access their councillors, their town information, participation, engagement, all of those things that we're often talking about as being integral to what we're about as a town and as a community.
Regional Councillor?
Yeah, I think it's an area that I'm glad we're looking at it. We need to look at it a little more, and there's been some concern about this. I'm not sure, I'll be frank, that perhaps the mayor was just limiting his comments to himself and so as not to comment to others, but I think to point to the Municipal Act and say it says that the mayor should be a community leader and do good, I'm sure the Municipal Act wasn't intending that other members of council shouldn't do that. Or, I mean, maybe we should look at the name, having your name, maybe your name shouldn't, one of the parameters we could say is if you're doing an event, it's the ward event or it's the mayors or the regional councillors event, but it's not, then your name is not included as a way of at least sending a message to people this isn't about promotion, although I would argue that typically the reason a name is included is because it helps to attract donations and volunteers and momentum behind it. But, and frankly, it's one of the, I've said it to people, it's one of the great things about this job is that the role allows me, when there's a small community not-for-profit group that's struggling to pull off something that benefits hundreds of people in the community, I'm able to call up somebody in the business community and say, hey, would you consider helping these guys out, or we can start a fundraiser and create some great good, and you're frankly creating it through your name. And is there a potential for favoring incumbents? Well, if a couple of us work on a fundraiser to build a new park, and a lot of good is done through that, and that sheds positively on us, well, that means we worked hard and did a good job. That's maybe the favoring that comes out of it. So, like the others, I wouldn't want to move towards eliminating this, but again, I do think we're going through an important process, and we should be looking for opportunities and best practices. And if that means, even though there's a downside, but eliminating names, actual names, as a small step. The other one I would say, and this will be a little more controversial, and I know some will say, oh, but I have to do it. I don't believe anything has to be done. The community survived before these events were invented, and they'll survive after. I think we should actually move towards having no events of any nature whatsoever in election years. The fact of the matter is, until the legislation is changed, and it should be changed, to not allow for you to file to run for office in January the 1st of an election year, for now that is the case. And that means that, frankly, as of January 1st, whether you filed or not, or whether you hold off until your event's over, or you're running, and it's an election. And I think that we could go a long way to sending a message to people that we're trying to continue to do good in the community, but but respect the political process and try to be as fair to non-incumbents as possible. And so I think that's I think that is something we should look at.
I just want to compliment folks for the quality of the discussion on the first two items, because these are not easy questions, and I think we've heard some expansive thoughts on two very difficult but very high-level comments. Before I move on to the third difficult one, is there any different point of view or different perspective that wants to be shared on this topic? So we get into the question of conflict of interest. Many of you in phase one and many of our clients in other jurisdictions have said, I'm a counselor, but I don't fully understand the law, and I don't fully feel comfortable with understanding how it applies to me. So I'm not sure when an issue comes before council whether I should declare a conflict up front, that seems to be a little easier, whether I should participate in the discussion, that seems to be a little bit more complex, whether I should participate in the vote, a little more complex, or whether I may actually be disturbing the vote if I declare a conflict and don't vote. And so how does that affect the numbers and the appearance of integrity? And so a number of integrity commissioners are putting in place an education program together with an ethics question and answer manual, which hopefully this kind of information can be provided. I did hear comments from a number of counselors in phase one that they didn't feel comfortable with their mastery of the subject. They acknowledged and recognized that the law had its limitations, and they would welcome some education. So what I've chosen to do, with the concurrence of your new integrity commissioner, I didn't need his permission, but I made him aware of this fact, is I wanted to raise the question with you of whether or not you were prepared to consider language which would address family and non-pecuniary conflicts of interest. So in other words, this is not the notion that family members can't sit on community boards or that you can't sit on community boards, but it would recognize that the law right now is difficult and awkward. The Municipal Conflict of Interest Act really is not something that can be adjudicated by an integrity commissioner. It has to be by a member of the judiciary. And the terms are so straight and narrow that where they've been applied, it's been done brutally and with significant consequence to individuals. And so most integrity commissioners are encouraging counselors to get some education in this area, but to get some education in this area requires some higher level understanding on your part that this is something that you'd be prepared to get some education about. The existing position would be we're not interested in anything that's other than a pecuniary conflict of interest. The reality position among the two previous topics that I raised with you is I didn't have a recommendation of best practice. This one I am making a suggestion. I think the best practice is that you be inoculated to an understanding of what conflict of interest is, both personal as well as pecuniary, and that you empower this and allow this to happen when you discuss this particular topic. So I'm interested in comments on this third larger choice issue. Is this something that you want to go with the narrow letter of the law, or you want to open up to some proactive education and some opportunity to be able to help protect yourself so that you avoid potential allegations that could result in very severe judicial consequence?
Councillor Vey?
Thank you. I've always found this area very interesting for a number of reasons. One, conflict of interest can also involve the criminal courts too, if it goes far enough. So it's not just when we speak of the judiciary, it's not just civil, if I'll call it that. And certainly when direct family members, and I like the way Regional Councillor Taylor put it, within the inheritance line, certainly something like that, those conflicts can be real, but frankly they can also be real if it's my brother or sister doing this, perhaps favoritism to help out family members. But then once you start going down that road, you start talking about favoritism to help out a friend, may not be a business partner, etc. So I always find this very, quite frankly, very difficult, and myself, and I've seen other members of council do it also, is, as we say, out of an abundance of caution. And we declare conflicts where realistically there isn't, but there's a lot of fear involved in this too, quite frankly, and you want to avoid that, even just the appearance, because you can be criticized for that even if the conflict is not real. In terms of people sitting on community boards, et cetera, like you're almost looking at two streams of conflict of interest. One where there clearly is no real specific pecuniary interest. We did mention boards. It could be even if your child plays on a sports team, and because the arenas are subsidized, but it's a common interest. It's nothing specific to yours. So you'd almost be looking, in my opinion, on two streams on this. Pecuniary, definitely, but then another one just having to do with the appearance of favoritism, even if there's no direct benefit, but perhaps it could be perceived as showing that favoritism because of a family member sits on a community board, and you really support that organization also, and you want to help them in some way. They've come forward for a grant or something. So clearly that family member is not benefiting in any way, but there's a perception that that you're voting this way to support that family member, as opposed to just supporting the cause. So I find this very complex, and I do see at least two streams in it. Certainly some sort of training would be beneficial, but I'd really be looking for a way of, because now you're dealing with the public, to avoid that abundance of caution vote just because of perception, and that's the part that I really don't know how to avoid that or to address that, because there will always be members of the public that will say, aha, if you do something like that, so we do that. So I know my comments are a little bit rambling, but I do see this as at least two streams, and we really need guidance. But unfortunately, you're not able to educate the public at the same time.
Well,
to any
there are a couple of tools in this document actually which will address educating the public. So it won't necessarily be through the text in the code, but there are some tools that will be complementary, and I'll identify them in the course of this morning, that actually may help in that area. So you've raised an excellent point with that one.
Councillor Bazance.
Thank you. I think in any event, I would be supportive of and actually encouraging education around what the letter of the law is, and also just sort of better understanding however we land on the code in this particular provision of it, so that everybody is sort of comfortable with understanding what the implications are. But I also look at this as one of those ones that you would have to apply the sniff test to. And if it were something that, even though the letter of the law or going beyond it wasn't really prescriptive, but I just had some concerns that whatever the situation was may be perceived as being a conflict, would there be an opportunity then for me as a member of council to go to the Integrity Commissioner and just sort of on my own and say, here's what my concern is, and discuss it in that way, and then based on whatever information I get, to then come back and make my own decision based on that. And then, I think that I would feel more comfortable too saying that, initially I felt that there could be a potential that it could be perceived in this way, even though I didn't really feel that there was a conflict. I took it that next step did have a discussion with somebody who is a little bit more learned in this area, and in the end, this is where I've landed in my decision, and I'm comfortable with it.
Good.
Is that something that is typically done, or?
Absolutely. I mean, the way we phrased this one is going back to your integrity commissioner and saying these people acknowledge that this may be beyond the letter of the law, but there is a concern in council with the appearance, and they want to give validity to the opportunity to be able to ask before they act, so that they can all be educated in this area, whether it's for new councillors, particularly those who come from a business background and perhaps aren't aware of the particular nuances for a public servant or for somebody in elected office, but also as a regular upgrade. And so these are the opportunity for prophylactic comments about this is appropriate and inappropriate. And they're, quite frankly, at the crudest level, a defense in the courts. I went to the integrity commissioner and I got a formal opinion that this was appropriate or inappropriate, in a much stronger position, if that's something you would allow in this choice area. Yeah.
I like the idea that you can have that discussion, the ask before you act, with the integrity commissioner. If we feel that we need more education around the Conflict of Interest Act, I know that we did have early on in the term, part of our orientation, we went through the Conflict of Interest Act, but to refresh that, I think, is a good idea. But I think more importantly is that the conflict of interest is a very personal thing, because you could have an interest in this, that, and the other thing, and I've encouraged people to seek their own independent legal advice in terms of in what situation should I be declaring a conflict of interest because of my own personal involvement, either financially. And so what I would like to see is that in addition to getting your own personal legal advice, that the municipality reimburses you for that, because I think it'll reflect on the municipality the way that you act in terms of your responsibility as an elected official. So there should be some provision for remuneration or for recovery of the cost of getting independent legal advice to a certain extent. I don't want to see an estate plan or anything like that be put forward, but based on your individual and circumstances, where should I start? Make sure that I exercise some degree of caution. And again, the benefit to that is if a situation that you did not foresee arises very quickly, at least then you have someone who has an inventory of your interests that can advise you legally as to whether or not you should declare an interest or not. So there's some benefit to that too. Regional Councillor?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's interesting too, the Integrity Commissioner idea, and if it's a written opinion from the Integrity Commissioner, I don't know if that's as strong or as helpful in a court case eventually as it would be from legal representation. But one or the other, I think, is a step in the right direction. The only thing I'd say as a caveat, and I probably assume it was intended that way, but is that I think probably the best way to, if we were going to go the legal way, like you could get legal advice on conflict. The region does this, by the way. But is that it would probably, I think it should be through a set lawyer that's a town lawyer, and because you wouldn't want to, as the mayor alluded to, you wouldn't want to be in a circumstance where somebody goes out and meets 8 times because they found it fascinating and come back and drop a $10,000 bill on the table, right? So I think it would have to go through a set, somebody who's recognized as that's the go-to person through the municipality officially, or the Integrity Commissioner, whichever one seems to be a best practice. But I think either of those is a step in the right direction. I think members of council, many, including myself, have struggled in the past with, is it a conflict, is it not? And then you struggle with the idea. I mean, most of us are on budgets, right? So you struggle with, I'm not entirely sure, but do I really want to go and spend $1,000 or $2,000 finding out? And so I think it would be better if there was definitiveness and as the mayor said, probably to the benefit of the town. So.
I just wanted to clarify, John, that the region provides for reimbursement, or my concern would be, is the suggestion that municipal legal staff would provide that advice, or the municipality would reimburse for independent legal advice?
I'm not positive how the region does it, because I just found this out, but I no, obviously it wouldn't be that municipal staff provide legal advice, but I don't think it should be reimbursement either of your own legal advice. I think it should be a external legal counsel that has been set for that very purpose, that can be monitored by town staff for how much advice you're getting, or what that they have a contractual understanding about, that you can't just go off and provide $10,000-$15,000 worth of advice on a single question or something. So I think it should be a set person, and that we all can't go find our own people. And I think that helps us too around the whole issue of tendering, and how much you should be going and getting, second prices on, et cetera, second quotes. And
Okay. Councillor Bazans?
Just further to that, then a question for clarification, because my understanding is that there's sort of the legal answer, according to the law, but then there's the perception and the sort of how things may be seen by members of the public or others, and how that may affect your decision making. So I guess with respect to seeking a legal opinion on something, if I had a pretty strong inclination that some matter that I was engaged in and involved with may breach legalities, then I would think that that's up to me then to seek my own legal counsel and get that opinion. But I guess what I was looking more for is the opportunity to have an integrity commissioner on call, if you will. So if we have our IC is on retainer, so that as council members we don't feel constrained by, every time I call him on something, the clock is going to start ticking, and the billable hours are going to start ticking, but rather to sort of encourage us to utilize that resource. So maybe that's a way of, having a resource there that we don't have to incur our own personal costs for, but then encourages councillors, if there is something that's a little more ambiguous, that we, our tummy is telling us maybe we should check it out, that we're not hesitant to go and use that resource, just because it may start the clock ticking on the meter.
If I might just take a moment to draw your attention to the slide that's on the screen now. There are language used around the right thing and the wrong thing that are often interchangeably used. So people talk about values and ethics and the law and morality as if they're the same thing. And while they do overlap, they are not necessarily the same thing, as I think is well appreciated in this room. So you can have morality, you can have culturally determined rights or wrong, whether or not it's appropriate for someone to wear a niqab at a public citizenship ceremony, or whether or not it's appropriate to serve or not serve someone coming for public services based upon certain cultural values. Mores, or culturally determined rights or wrong, are not necessarily the same as the law, because some things may be permitted in law that many people from a moral, a religious, a cultural, a national point of origin point of view think are appropriate or inappropriate according to their own mores. And similarly, what we're talking about here is ethics. We're talking about cross-cultural rights or wrongs, which say this may be your individual morality or your religion's morality, but it is not necessarily the same as the ethical principles that have been now defined in a code of conduct for town staff and now for elected officials. So what you're interested in is getting some legal advice, and the point I think has been made that the virtue of the Integrity Commissioner is this is not only legal advice for the individual, but it's collective legal advice. It's part of the education framework where you can request information and answer to a particular question, but if you're asking the question, it may very well be something of concern to your colleague, and the virtue of doing this in-house through a lawyer who is your Integrity Commissioner is you are getting legal advice. And if this person is also skilled and trained in terms of ethics, which is a standard which incorporates the letter of the law, but is higher than the letter of the law, then you're even in a stronger position, not only legally, but also morally. And you can make that case to your constituents that I have considered the moral, the cultural, the religious dimensions of this issue. And so I have a reflection that deals with perceptions as well as reality, and that deals with a clear difference when my constituents may be coming from a different point of view. I can articulate what is an appropriate ethical standard, and it's not necessarily the same as a moral or a legal standard.
I see that we're at about 10:15. I would like to wrap up by about 11:30 at the latest, so just to kind of set some parameters around there. Does anybody feel like we need a short break? 5 minutes, would that be good? Okay, can we do that? Is this a good time to take a 5-minute break?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. 15. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Compliment people on the quality of the discussion. I'm now going to draw your attention to the 7-page table matrix that you have in front of you. This is going to be your note-taking exercise. I'm going to be covering some 35 different topics, all of which are addressed in detail in a 40-page submission that we've given to staff, which will be circulated to you, I understand, in the very near future. But what I want to try and do is to capture all of the specific elements. Now that you've made some essential choices which will help structure the discussion, I want to go into a number of detailed areas that all of which are in writing, all of which you can see and make reference to. But this is your opportunity. If you have a question about a particular topic, ask it now. If you think it's a no-brainer and it deserves to go ahead, this is your opportunity on your sheet just to indicate, I like this one, or this one I'm going to study in more detail. So each of these on the sheet are referenced to a much larger document about the specific language that's proposed, about definitions that may be added, about tools and ways of implementing this in the code or elsewhere. So this is a topical discussion, not necessarily for comment or opinion, as was the previous session, but this is what you might want to focus in on if you have a concern about the theme, because it will be addressed in the final set of recommendations that Ethics Scan is making to you. So by all means, indicate if you have a comment on any of the subjects. We're going to be going through them quite quickly, and they get easier as we go further down in the document. We've done the hard sledding already in the first session. So item number 4.
Could we go back to item number 1, because I do have a concern about annual statements of assets, income, and liability.
Yeah.
So I do have a concern about that.
No, and that's and nobody was commenting on that. That was just framing the discussion. Yeah. That point was made. Yes. So if we can start with number 4, the existing code applies to members, and members are not only defined as councillors and the mayor and regional councillor, but they also refer to appointees, committees, and members of boards. And I'm raising here the question about which particular committees, who is covered by this particular text. And so item number 4 that you can find in the document makes particular reference to clarity about who's covered by the code. And that will be addressed in the code itself. The next one.
Oh, regional council.
I do want to make a comment, really, and I'll try to be quick, because
Sure.
I know you got a lot to cover here. But first of all, I get, obviously you would want to give some thought to committee of adjustment, because it has weightier decisions that one might want to influence. So that might want to be included in some form. But I have to say, with the exception of that one, my strong feeling would be the code should not apply at all, or only as advisory, but it should not be in any way able to trigger an integrity commissioner investigation upon a volunteer member of a committee. And I'll probably be blunt in here. I think that process would probably get abused. So I hope we're not contemplating that. Thanks.
So just to clarify, are there any other statutory committees? Maybe that should apply to statutory committees. Okay.
The language is referenced in the particular recommendation, and so we will definitely address that point. The next one, number 5, is a gifts framework. This is something that we are recommending. We expand the definition of what a gift is in the text, and that there be some notion here that gifts be further clarified. There are 3 essential positions that are taken in municipalities. The rarest is that there is no gifts whatsoever. There is the existing position of the town, which is that gifts are permitted under certain circumstances and in certain situations. And then there is a third position which is recommended in the text where there may be the need for certain clarifications on the asking of gifts and the receiving of gifts. So those are in the text. No one is recommending that gifts be prohibited, although you should understand that more and more jurisdictions are actually saying, let's avoid this altogether. Let's have no gifts asked for or received, and then we don't get into the problem in this area. Assuming that we're going to tighten up the existing structure, specific text is given for you to be able to read, and you'll find that in the document. Not seeing any questions, we'll move on to the next one. The text does not address lobbyists, and we are not necessarily recommending that lobbyists appear in the Code of Conduct. But obviously, some jurisdictions have gone so far as to create a lobbyist registry. There are now 2 municipalities that have them. There are 2 that are having them under active considerations. There's no suggestion in our material that you find a recommendation for a lobbyist registrar, but there is some thought that the Ethics Question and Answer Manual can provide some education about what are, in other jurisdictions, appropriate dealings with lobbyists. So if you're interested in that item, you might tick it off on your page. This is some clarification of how we might address who a lobbyist is and what are appropriate dealings with a lobbyist. The next one, number 7 on the second page, is social media. This is obviously a very contentious and hot and topical issue. It was one of the items where we sought your opinion in phase 1, where there was commentary and a specific session dedicated to the question in topic 2. There are very few municipalities that actually have text that deal with what is the policy for councillors. Many municipalities have text about what is appropriate for staff. We are making recommendations in the corporate policy area, not in the code, that deal with specifically what are the responsibilities and what are good guidance for you individually. And so if that topic is of interest to you, I'm encouraging you to go to the substantive document and take a look at it. We think it will provide some stronger text and language about what is suitable and appropriate behavior in social media.
Regional Councillor? No, oh, sorry, Councillor Bay.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you for this document. I'm not exactly matching it to this. It's just a comment over here. It says number 7 gift framework, but on this sheet here, number 7 is social media. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge tracking that. Just a quick comment on the social media. And I had mentioned to you, and I mentioned to my colleagues on council before, basically, if you're not willing to say it in this chamber, don't say it on Facebook. And the same standards apply. The great challenge with that is that people quite often do use proxies, be it a spouse, a friend, a supporter, something like that, or an anonymous account, to skirt around that. And so I'm not suggesting that I have any ways of governing that, or I don't want the octopus to reach too far out. But certainly amongst members of council sitting around this table or in any future table, if you're not willing to say it in here, don't say it on social media, because we're going to hold you to the same standard.
Yeah, it's a very important point. It's covered in the document, and we also address the question because some councils are now banning live opportunity of posting while the council is in session. So these topics are all covered on that particular item. And in reference to your question, in the 35-page document that you'll be looking at in detail, it's actually the consultant reference number that will put you directly to that particular item. So these are the order in which we're talking about them today, but the actual where they appear in the document is the second line in terms of the number sequence. The next one...
Oh, Regional Councillor?
Sorry.
I guess one thing I want to know, so is this next coming back as a draft code? Is that the next step, as we just see a draft?
The next step is you will get a 35-page set of comments about this is the existing specifics in the draft code. These are the text changes that we are recommending in the code. These are some areas that may be better addressed in a policy, and so the policy is defined. Where there are missing definitions, that also
Right.
appears in this document.
So I'm either confused by, or I'll just state my wish that we had. I mean, I have to say, the first document, I couldn't quite tell what the description of logic was on some, because it's pretty brief. And I'm not sure why we didn't get this in advance. It would have been incredibly helpful, because now the next stage I'm going to get is pretty much a draft code. And this gives me a lot more detail and quickly looking into. But anyway, maybe we need to revisit one more time, or I guess we can submit written comments, but then you don't get a real feel for, is that sort of, you get a sense that that's where council is leaning or not.
Right.
I mean, and anyway.
My fundamental recommendation to staff was we need to have a discussion of the high order choice issues. We've done that. And I made a judgment call that rather than get involved in the minutiae of, let's look at line 3 and spend 35 minutes literally on an excellent discussion, we missed the overview. And so my recommendation to staff was let's let people be aware of what we're dealing with, where it's going to appear in the material they're looking at, and then you get back to your mayor and your CAO with some idea about how you want to treat this. Several of the items are housekeeping and bookkeeping. I don't think are going to be problematical. But
I'll keep it at a high level, but at a high level, and I didn't, again, it's hard to tell from the description of logic, but when I hear your statement, I guess what I heard Councillor Vague say is, it should be the same standard online as it is here, and I don't think that's what's being recommended, actually. What I'm hearing is that there would be policy adjustment or policy directions around social media, but not code of conduct.
That's right.
So that's not treated the same as we do in the council chambers, because your comments in the council chambers are captured by the code of conduct. So anyway, where I'm going with that is I actually agree with Councillor Vague. I don't know to what other level other jurisdictions have this, but we've had somewhat of a unique experience for the past 4 years. And I won't hesitate to say that I think we need to, you don't know what the future holds. I think if it's realistic or possible or done in other jurisdictions, if it's actionable and it's somewhat of a best practice anywhere, I think we should be saying that the only thing that'll stop somebody from saying horrible things about their colleagues, which makes all of council look bad in the public, it degrades democracy, the only thing that'll stop them is if they think there is a potential consequence, i.e. there could be an investigation and a penalty. And so if we are able to say that, I'm willing to live by it. I'm willing to live by I'm not allowed to call my colleagues names on social media. So we should, I would really like to see us do that if we can.
So let me just clarify. You can do that presumably in a policy, or you could do it in a code. We're recommending a policy rather than a normative code. Would you want to see it in the code as opposed to a policy?
Well, I guess I'd ask the question. I lean towards the code only because I know policy, there's statements in a code that can lead to policy being considered through an integrity commissioner, but it's a less direct route. Okay. And if it's stated clearly in a code of conduct, you cannot say disparaging comments about your colleagues or members of the public in social media because it reflects poorly upon the town of Newmarket and the council or whatever, then you do it. You can say, integrity commissioner, because my understanding from integrity commissioners in the past is they enforce the code. And maybe if the code references another policy, they can then, do that policy through that. But maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe they can enforce all policies.
I think the integrity commissioners that have served you in the past and going forward would be looking at the code as one of the source materials. But I've looked at George Rustai's material. I've looked at Suzanne Craig's material. She definitely makes reference to policies where they are relevant to a judgment. But your point is an important one, and certainly I think it will be carried through.
Sorry. Go ahead. I agree. I agree. She makes reference. I've seen other integrity commissioners make reference, but they're often as how they come out of the code, and the code is kind of the bio. That's what I need to apply, and so I think if unless it's told to us that it's a mistake or it's failed another, it doesn't work, I'd prefer to see some statement around social media in the code.
That's fine, and I appreciate your taking the time to say that. This is the opportunity for doing so. There also is an opportunity on reflection over the next couple of weeks as you look at this material in more detail to also make those comments. But this is exactly what we're hoping to do.
Okay, Andrew, maybe you can speak to process as well.
Sure. Just with regard to the question around the scope of the authority for the Integrity Commissioner, just looking at the Municipal Act, it does reference the Code of Conduct, but it also talks about any procedures, rules, and policies of the municipality and local boards governing the ethical behavior. So it's the Integrity Commissioner can reference more than just the code itself with regard to their authority.
Sorry if I can ask this question, if you don't know, it's fine, but can they apply 2 or 3 optional penalties on other policy or only on the code?
On all,
They could, so.
yes, given the scope of their
As a matter of fact, if you'll pardon me for interjecting, I will actually be addressing that as one of the items here. One of the items later on talks about the opportunity of applying judgments above and beyond the letter of the law, but in the spirit of the law. Those are articulated and defined in your larger document, and one of the things that we'll be covering is the recommendation that you actually allow them to put in place these many other correctives or sanctions or recommendations for punishment or correction. And I'll make reference to that specifically when we get to that item.
And is there a benefit to having it in both places?
Yeah.
Is there a benefit to having them in both places, both in the code and in policy? So,
I don't think they necessarily have to be duplicated, but if you chose one rather than the other, it could be switched. We're recommending that it appears specifically in the code here.
yeah, okay, good. Thank you. Councillor Bay?
That's very, very quickly, I think Regional Councillor Taylor makes an excellent point distinguishing between policy and code, and I overlooked that. But typically, policy typically refers to staff, but councillors were not typical staff, and so that's why I think some of these things, and it's one of the things I'll be keeping an eye on, should, yes, we do need a policy, a corporate policy for staff, but I think we do need some of these things right in our code of conduct. I feel that makes it a lot stronger. Also, when we do come on council, I believe we do part of our oath is that we will follow the code of conduct, and we do sign off on that. I'm not sure if we sign off on a corporate policy. So it just firms it up and makes it clear to everyone, because you'd hate for someone to make the defense saying, well, I'm not typical staff. So as a councillor, and it's true, we're not typical staff, therefore that doesn't necessarily apply to me.
Thank you. Now we're at item number 7.
I think maybe the other possibility, but I want to say the social media one is important, I think, to the council. So I think maybe the other possibility is to, as the mayor said, is to reference it in the code and say, that to adhere by the standards set out in the policy in relation to social media and conduct towards your colleagues in the public. And then the policy can, but at least it's embedded in the code there and it can be referenced specifically or something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so number 8, a number of integrity commissioners are recommending to councils that you have a service warranty. So when there is a complaint, how many days involved in the acknowledgement, say 2 to 3 days for acknowledging, how many days to do an initial assessment about whether it's frivolous or vexatious, how many days are required to be able to assess the complaint, whether if there needs to be an extension because it's particularly onerous or difficult. The notion on this one is we are recommending in the code of conduct there be something that apprises the public that there is a timeliness to the complaint investigation process, and you can expect to have your complaint acknowledged, dealt with a recommendation to council in a certain period of time.
Does that capture during an election period? I think
That's a different one that we'll be addressing, but it is an important additional point. There is a complaint process. Number 9 and number 10 deal with the existing complaint processes. They do not appear in the code right now. We are recommending specifically that they do so. There's a description of the code processes. Anita Moore has provided very interesting diagnostics of what it looks like on a flow chart. And so we are recommending that those principles and your interim process be formalized in the code, both for the formal complaint process and the informal complaint process. I differentiated 9 and 10 because, frankly, the legislation is not terribly clear as to what the informal complaint process might look like and what mediation or arbitration or in texture and substance what the informal process might contain. And some of you did express in the interviews I did with you in phase 1, I don't know what's involved in that process. You don't stand alone because the legislation doesn't provide much guidance. We've attempted in the detailed document that you'll be looking at to offer some descriptions of what that process might look like. That's number 10. Number 11, we've already alluded to. This is the idea of creating a standing committee of council. Mostly it's non-councilors. It really is an attempt for those people that are interested in governance issues and accountability issues and transparency issues to volunteer to participate in particular topics that are recommended by council. It's worked extremely effectively and very well in other jurisdictions, and so this is something that we are providing by way of guidance. It's not something you have to vote upon, but it's something that you might want to consider. It has obviously economic consequences, but it does work in other jurisdictions. The next one is number 12. This is something that you've already addressed. It deals with specific education as it relates to conflict of interest. And what we are doing in this case is we are providing a new definition of conflict of interest in the code, and we're making a specific recommendation on policy. So the policy would inform the education that you're being offered. If that's of interest to you, you can find it in the deeper document as item number 27. The number 13 we've already discussed, but I'll just capture it here. This is the notion that you clearly understand and like the idea of asking before acting mentality. And we've explained the logic that you're not obligated to accept the recommendations, but the Integrity Commissioner is. And so this is your way of getting a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's your way of getting good advice at a low-cost basis, and it's not just advice for you. It can be advice that you think would benefit every single counselor, because it would be with your understanding that who asked the question would be kept anonymous, but it would be information and direct advice that would be made available to everyone. So this is the act before asking mentality. Number 14. Sure, absolutely.
I see the educational benefit of that approach, but has there been any ever raised in other jurisdictions about, does that act as a deterrent to asking and getting good advice and getting clarification on tricky issues when you know it's going to be, I know your name's not attached to it, yeah, but if it's specific advice you're looking for, half the time people are going to know who's asking, and I wonder if that doesn't act as a deterrent to actually availing yourself of that opportunity, because I'm like, I'd love to have some answer to this, but I don't necessarily want a page document sent to all my colleagues about this is the answer on that question that clearly is about X, Y, or Z.
The answer that I give couldn't cover every eventuality, but I have experience in detailed discussions with 8 or 10 colleagues that do this on a regular basis. And while we can't necessarily fully provide for anonymity, which is your point, it is good value for money advice and good value for time advice. And so the notion is of secondary consideration is sometimes it's pretty clear who asked the question, but the reality is that if it's of interest to one counselor, it's almost invariably of interest to more than one.
Okay, and it's considered a public document, whatever's sent out?
Yes, yes. So the advice, if you buy into this idea of an ethics Q&A manual, is that this would be information. So-and-so asked a question about how we handle sitting on a community board? Where is the definition of conflict of interest? Because it should be possible to do so. Whatever advice is provided to the individual is then made available to all elected officials.
And public.
And
And posted on the
presumably
web.
to the public, yep. So, number 14 is a technical one. I asked questions around the topic in phase 1, and this dealt with confidentiality of how the Integrity Commissioner does the complaint investigation. Is it done using the town's email? Are interviews done on the town site? What kind of assistance is provided in terms of information from staff? So what access do you have to documents? How readily and regularly it's made available? And so there's some technical details in here in terms of what an Integrity Commissioner needs to have in order to be able to do his function. That's captured in number 14. It doesn't appear in any of your documents and is something that's worthwhile mentioning. Number 15 deals with when you choose to call upon a closed meeting investigator, an ombudsman, or an Integrity Commissioner. It's a process-related question. I'm not necessarily sure that you need to have written framework for the process, but nonetheless, it strikes me that you may want to consider whether there is a process in mind, whether there's a logic that informs when you might call upon one of those independent officers, even though they have different tasks. So number 15, which is on your detailed document, is number 35, offers some idea of what that process might look like and what the benefits are of putting that in writing in place. Number 16 is an important topic. You have a very, very small reference to non-retaliation in the staff code of conduct, but you really aren't looking at a question which repeatedly came up in the phase 1, which is what kinds of protection are there for members of the public who choose to raise an allegation? And that can not only be from a staff member, but it could also be another counselor or more particularly the general public. And one of the serious high-profile issues of concern in transparency and accountability in the public and private sector today is good whistleblower protection. That if somebody out of good conscience comes forward, that they don't lose their job, or they don't lose their contract with the city, or they don't lose their opportunity to be able to have some job security or to influence their further relations with council. So if that's a good governance principle, it's something that we're recommending specific policy tweaks, and you'll find text that we're recommending in this particular item.
So with respect to this item, what about frivolous and vexatious actions? I guess that would be covered in the other areas.
It would be covered by the other topics. This is to say not specifically related to frivolous and vexatious, because that will be part of the complaint investigation process, but if you do come forward, that you're not hurt or hammered. The reality is, for an ethics consultancy like ourselves with 25 years of experience, whenever we've been called in to do an investigation, there always was somebody aware that something was not quite right with an expense account or with influence that had been threatened or withheld. And so what you want to try and do is to make it very, very clear that somebody that comes forward is given voice. If you'll permit me parenthetically to make an observation, one of the weaknesses in the current legislation as it exists now is complaints require a complainant. And unlike most other jurisdictions, other provinces or other states, when a complaint comes forward, it is then owned by the Integrity Commissioner. One of the flaws in the Ontario legislation is if the complainant, for whatever reason, decides to withdraw the complaint, it no longer exists. It could be not frivolous and vexatious. It could be very real. It could be talking to an actual corruption issue. But in point of fact, the complaint has no legs in the current legislation because it isn't in the public interest or in the public trust. That's not something you need to concern yourself with, but it is something that we will address, at least in terms of the retaliation element. Number 17 deals with the role that you play on council and in the community. There was strong expression of interest on the part of the community that there are a number of rules and guidelines dealing with not-for-profit organizations and charities about you being able to hold multiple leadership roles. And so this is areas that we can cover in the ethics Q&A and will appear in some policy recommendations. If you're particularly interested in that, you'll find that in the relevant section of our detailed report. This has come up as a question already in this meeting, which is, what do we do in the case of a complaint against an individual? You now have a process of certain complaints that are being investigated, but this is the question, what do you do about a complaint that arises during an election period and or is held till after the election period, and what do you do if that person is no longer re-elected? So some thoughts and recommendations on that topic are offered in number 18. Some of this is going to be reflected, we have reason to believe, in the new legislation, but we want you to be aware of what the connotations and the elements are in that discussion. I'm on the next page and I'm looking at number 19. This one I've already stated. It's something that is more a culture item than it is a policy item, but we believe strongly, and I think there is a sense that there is a need to be able to create some openness and transparency on a regular basis, so that if you are asking for a gift or you receive a gift, it should be reported. Some of you may have a problem with that. I'm leaving that entirely in your ballpark. It is the overwhelming sense that in transparency and accountability regimes like this one, that everybody, not just a mayor and a regional councillor, provides that kind of information as a regular part of just not wanting to be involved in potentially perceived messy items. That's covered in a policy recommendation, which you'll find under this item.
Okay, regional councillor?
Sorry, I want to clarify, because it's been mentioned twice, and I wouldn't want to have, I don't record gifts in any way, so I don't know if the mayor does, but no, okay.
So you, at all?
No.
Okay.
There's very little to record, but I don't.
I understand.
And I guess if we are considering going down this road, and it could come back to draft policy, I don't know when or how, but I really would like help understanding, and probably before it's enacted in policy, that, you know, I know there'll be education later, but how does that, I mean, how does that work when it comes to, does the gift have to be tied to town business, or is it, like I said, if it's my neighbor or a friend I grew up with, how do you distinguish those?
There is specific language that's used in a number of other jurisdictions that deals with whether it is a gift that relates to town business and whether it might logically be perceived of as being a gift that would be related to your decision making.
Okay,
and
that's
so,
helpful.
And so you'll find text in there which should address this.
And how does it speak to? Does gifts then becomes of all kind, like including if you're invited to attend an event, you know, every time you're attended to say, let's go to a gala or sit at a table, why don't you join our table at this hospital fundraiser? That would all be recorded?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not something that's a pleasant aspect, particularly because you are on council for the right reasons. You're there to be able to benefit the public and to demonstrate that governance can be improved. The reality is that this is a messy area, and gifts are a difficulty in growing numbers and proportions. And so what you're trying to do is to say, if we're not prepared to outlaw gifts wholly, then what we want to do is at least be transparent with each and every one. So we're
Right.
adopting that standard.
I would like to have a discussion at some point, and I'd be interested in what other council members think, though, about, I don't want to sound dramatic, but about outlawing them wholly. Now, that sounds dramatic, but the reason I say that only is because, you know, by the time you got to go through hassle of recording, you know, a gift, and I don't know if that includes if I get a, you know, an $80 plaque at an event, you know, does that become a gift? And it just becomes to the point where you're going to probably stop doing, you know, whatever little you're already doing anyway, because it's just not worth the hassle, A. B. But then I would suggest that we look at it in light of just increasing, to offset the impact to a certain degree, increasing our events account by a small amount, which probably would cover off those things that are relatively rare, I think, for everybody, and just not do it. Like, we created a whole new bureaucracy and tracking system like we do right now for expenses and now on gifts, and they're not that common. So I don't know if I'm going to get down to that few and have a registry, and it, you know, becomes, part of me just says, let's just be done with it.
It's an extremely important point, and I'm drawing staff's attention to this. I mean, if you were to ask me to offer a professional opinion, I don't know why the gifts are tolerated at all. If they are infrequent, and if they carry the potential opprobrium attached to them, then why not offset in just the way you've talked about, and why not say, we don't do gifts around here? Right. It is a different regimen. It's not something that many municipalities are willing to step up in a leadership role, but it certainly can't be clearer a demonstration to the public of what your standards are, is instead of having to report after the fact, we don't do that around here. And it may be salutary in terms of the reputation of council were you to decide that that was an appropriate standard.
I don't know about our colleagues, and it's hard to, I know we have so time limit to make a decision of that magnitude here, but for future thought, I mean, I think we should give it some consideration and look at, if we're going to go down that road, part of me wants to say, look, it's either not enough of an issue to create the bureaucracy and the headache, and set up websites and tracking systems and staff time to monitor it. Either it's not enough an issue to bother doing it, period, or if it's an issue or we think it could become an issue in the future, then let's just eliminate it. Anyway, it's just a thought.
Yeah, it's been customary for us to receive, particularly at Christmas time, and I think that those individuals that provide those gifts, they're all aware that those gifts are subsequently raffled off and those funds go to a charity. How would you handle something like that?
It's a very messy slope because I have heard in more than one municipality there are contractors who regularly do business with the municipality that are expected to make some contribution to seasonal events. And so you can quickly elide from the first into the second. And so you have the very real possibility that it's expected that gifts are given because the town is a customer of a particular contractor or vendor. And so it's a problem area, and I hear what it is that's being suggested around the table. It needs some high-level discussion on your part about the perception on your mind of whether or not this is an issue for you in reality, and whether you think that the public is interested in a standard which may, quite frankly, be above the normal practice in other locations, but is prophylactic and responsible. And that's entirely a decision that you will have to make. The texts are here if you want to go in either route. Number 20 talks about providing more clarity
Councillor
about...
Corwin? I'm sorry, Councillor Corwin, I missed it.
Yes, sorry, Tony.
I was making a note.
I came in late. David, a question that concerns me. We're working through our code of conduct, and eventually by the end of probably 2016, it will be in play. It's going to take some time. I don't know when we'll pass it, but it'll be in time. Is the province coming down with a new set of code of conduct that applies to the province of Ontario? Will our code of conduct tie into that? Or what is the province doing?
Okay.
To me, we're fragmenting the province, the concern again. We have a code of conduct, the town of Newmarket, that's very strict and clear and full of integrity. Yeah. But the municipality next to us does not, or the city of Vaughan doesn't, or the city of Markham doesn't. Why isn't, to me, the province addressing this issue. I mean, we're hiring you to address it here in a small town of 100,000 people, but we're only 100,000 out of millions for the province of Ontario. And, you know, we're going to be because a golf tournament would not happen without the contribution of major players who do business with the town, period. Myself, I could never be able to put on a charity golf classic because I could not be able to raise the funds to do it, myself personally. I just don't have those contacts. But I see it happening in Markham, I see it happening in Vaughan, I see it happening in Aurora, and those tournaments, in my mind, are not going to happen without the contribution of businesses that do business with the town of Newmarket. Therefore, it could be that we decide here that we totally eliminate them, totally, right across the region of York. If we wish to be a knight in shining armor. So I have concerns that what we're doing here is not being done elsewhere. And that will affect us because it will affect the ability to raise funds for much needed charities, whether they are chats or whether they are a playground or whether they are helping a family that has lost their home. I mean, we do incalculable amount of good through some of the things that we do. However, without asking, and you have to ask because they're not going to come forward and do this. You have to make a phone call. Comment.
Clarify, I was talking about gifts, right, not fundraising and donations, which we have another topic, but
That's another,
this is just gifts, right?
Yeah, but in a sense, these people are making a gift toward the town of Newmarket through their funding. You might
So-
look at it differently
yeah.
individually, but I could not hold a golf tournament. I don't have the contacts. So I would be looking if I did as gifts, not necessarily to me, but to the golf tournament that reinforces Dave Kerwin's name. I'm really in a quandary here.
And I think we're probably anticipating some further regulation from the province for some consistency across the different municipalities. And so we might want to wait for that. I don't know how soon that comes across.
Let me make two
But,
quick
yeah.
observations. I think in terms of the province, it's a question of whether you can suck and blow at the same time. The original legislation was envisaged as empowering municipalities to be a power unto themselves and to be able to come up with their own code and not to require paternal relations or requirements on a local municipality. The current government is now struggling with how much of the legislation do we change and in what timbers. So can an individual municipality have its own integrity commissioner, or is there to be a provincial ombudsman who will play that role? This is a larger question than we're going to be able to solve in this room, and I think the province is struggling with that quandary because most Ontarians would be very comfortable with devolving that level of responsibility and authority to the municipality rather than having it imposed. That was the purpose behind the original legislation. But we don't know, any of us, what the province is going to come down to. On the second one, there are differences between authorized expenditures for programs in the community that are led by a councillor, and those are addressed in some of these recommendations, and some of the discussions we've already had this morning on the question of fundraising. And that's a separate issue, and you'll find it addressed in these documents here. I think it will be one that will allow a significant amount of autonomy to you as an individual, but there will be certain steps that will be put in place in terms of linkages to make sure that you're not duplicating effort in certain kinds of fundraising activities that may already be covered by the town or may be inappropriate in terms of when they take place.
Thank you. We have 20 minutes, and I did 20 minutes and 21 items.
All right, so let's see the progress we can make. Number 20 deals with clarity of communications, particularly things like transit stop advertising or the use of town emails. There is a definition of what a community event is and the use of constituency services and office budgets. Those of you that are concerned with that item will find it in the section. That's material we are proposing for the code. The second one, 21, we asked this question, do you want there to be a fee in initiating a complaint? The overwhelming response was no, both from staff and councillors. We think that that needs to be acknowledged, and if that indeed is your position, it should appear in social media, and so that's where it appears in this document. In terms of an overall service complaints process, many municipalities are moving toward having procedures and benchmarks for all forms of citizen service queries, and staff is actively at work through the CAO's office and the clerk's office in defining what that standard will be. That's referenced in 22. 23 is simple. It says that instead of having to call a consultant in every couple of years, that you have a mandate to staff that we will review and update the code every couple of years. The time period is less important. It doesn't matter whether it's 30, 36, or 42 months. It's just the idea that there be some regular update as a matter of good governance. 24 is an important topic. Many of you said, I bring to my councillor role certain community expectations and community responsibilities. I understand that when council makes a decision, I have to respect that decision, but I also want the right as a minority right, while still respecting the collegiality of council, to be able to say to my constituents, I was faithful to an issue or I disagreed with the majority. And so this is an important point in terms of your credibility and your reputation. We understood this comment that you made to us in phase 1, and you'll see a phrasing for that in item number 24 in terms of a recommendation. Members soliciting donations for member-organized activities. There are some other jurisdictions that do have more appropriate and detailed phrasing in their code of conduct. It could appear in the code of conduct or policy, and we're recommending what those phrasings might be in number 25. Number 26, sorry?
Regional Councillor?
This is number 37, right? In the
That's right.
And is that all that information there for discussion? Because what I read here on your small chart is to tweak the language. What I see is a lot of discussion, but what appears to be much more than tweaking it. Is that just thoughts, and the result of the thoughts is let's tweak a few things, or is this the basis of the tweaking?
The discussion in there is a discussion of the topic, what's being done in other jurisdictions, and there is a specific language recommendation that we are proposing under 37.
Is what's being considered a limit, an annual limit, like is discussed?
What is being done in other jurisdictions is being tabled here for your consideration. It's not being recommended. What we're doing is saying these are the kind of topics that are being offered. So, for example, in detail, some other jurisdictions talk about a specific date, about talking about non-conflicting with town programs, that talk about a dollar limit, that talk about not soliciting from lobbyists, disclosure from the clerk, and that surpluses be acknowledged and possibly returned. We're not making recommendations in this area. What we're doing is saying these are some topic areas that have been raised on this subject matter. And so it's not a recommendation. We're suggesting these are topics that you might choose to amplify what the language should be on your soliciting of member-organized event funding. Okay? Number 26, This is just a basic information item. Many people come to the clerk's office or to your office and say, I've got a problem, I don't know what to do, I don't know where I can get information. And so we thought it would be desirable, not in the code, but just in some basic town information, perhaps disseminated through the ethics question and answer manual, that people were made aware of. If you've got a question of a particular type, this is who you go to in order to be able to get an answer to your question or your query. Number 27, again, I didn't hear in the consultation thus far that there should be any form of cost recovery for closed meeting investigations, but that's something that it would be helpful if you could confirm, and then it could be included in a policy-related document that would provide the guidance and advice. Number 28 talks about how you relate to getting information directly to the Integrity Commissioner. The interim process is the one I think you're recommending, and we're just trying to clarify that, which is that as opposed to somebody submitting a document to you as counsel or through the clerk's office, that there actually be a direct communication to the Integrity Commissioner to be able to review complaints. If that's your will, then that's set up in 28. It confirms to a recommendation that was made to a previous Integrity Commissioner that you retained in terms of having a box here for that purpose. There are different technologies of how that would happen, but this addresses the nature of the process about something going directly to the officer rather than necessarily being vetted by counsel.
Regional Councilor.
Thanks. I'll just use this as the opportunity. I don't think I see it coming up as a clear topic, and I assume more than one member of council, maybe many, brought up the issue of vexatious or frivolous complaints. Is the best practice, is the only way to deal with that is the vetting process through the IC? What happens if somebody brings 18 code of conduct complaints next year? They all go to the IC and that person decides one at a time, frivolous or vexatious or not? Is there anybody else ever put into place another, for that rare instance where one or two people are driving a great deal of?
I monitor this pretty carefully, and I'm not aware of it having ever reached that extreme. But to the best of my knowledge, it's never come up as an issue where it gets repeated again and again and again. When it happens, it feels like it's the only thing that's happening. But you tend to have that resolve itself, either with a councillor no longer remaining on council or there being enough public pressure that issue just subsides.
Right, but any member of the public, even a former councillor, can continue to bring Integrity Commissioner complaints. And, but for now, what you're recommending, as far as you know, the only practice out there is to still provide everyone to the Integrity Commissioner.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, that's the nature of the legislation.
Yeah. Because that might absorb a considerable amount of resources if it becomes extreme. Would there be some way that council could monitor it in terms of like quarterly reporting or semi-annual reporting that would let us know how many of these issues have been reported by how many different people? I'm not saying that it would specifically point at any one individual, but that it would let council know the extent to which those resources are being used.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, and might I propose a parallel one to it, which is that council can express to the Integrity Commissioner, if he doesn't already plan this, to be able to comment in his annual report on whether this is indeed a problem. So the regional councillor is saying this can get to be an aggregate, a serious problem. It would be nice if you were able to communicate directly to the Integrity Commissioner comments of this kind where you feel it's an undue burden and punishment. Could you please make a comment of this kind in your annual report? It's certainly something that falls within his bailiwick and something that might address the problem that the regional councillor has posed.
Yep. Thank you.
Number 29 talks about the use of town resources in election campaigns and nomination campaigns. Staff has made me aware of the fact that there have been some problems related to complaints of former councillors and that the whole question about whether or not town resources are being used not only in municipal election campaigns but in any level of government's election campaigns or in nomination processes is a potential problem that needs to be addressed in corporate policy. We've done that. We've found literature in other jurisdictions, and you'll find that in number 49, which is here referenced as 29.
Okay. Regional Councillor, comments?
Yes, for various reasons, I have to comment on this, but I just want to say that it's my view that what we're doing here isn't broadening the rules to govern resource use in any election campaign, but we're clarifying the rules to ensure that it's clear that it governs the resource use in any election campaign. It's my view, clearly, I mean, it refers in our, I can point to it, but it talks about political parties. That clearly means not municipal elections. But I won't get into the debate, but I don't think we're broadening the rules. I think we're confirming or clarifying the rules.
Clear.
Thank
All
you.
right. And you'll have a chance to clearly make that point when this one comes up. The question about June 30th as a date for communicating to the public has emerged as an issue in some other jurisdictions, and trying to get a little more appropriate text around the question about allowable communication to the public tied to a particular subject is found either in the elected officials' expense policy or the election campaign activities policy, and we're attempting to harmonize those two and put the appropriate texts in those appropriate places. Number 31 talks about the use of town resources. This is one that we've covered when you think about it, and so this is one that we've identified the integrity test as a possibility for. So if you so designate to staff, the question might be to staff, can you look at some of these sniff tests, integrity tests? Could you define something that would be used by the public, that would be easily understood by the public, that staff would be able to immediately judge whether or not town resources was appropriate? And also for ourselves, it reflects our decision-making thoughts in this case. So is it fair? Is it honest? Is it reputable? Could we come up with a simply communicated, well-understood policy that would say that if something doesn't pass the sniff test or the smell test, don't get involved in bringing it to a councillor, don't get involved bringing it to an integrity commissioner. This is just something which is outside of the current understanding of what is good governance and best practice in this municipality. So it's offered as a suggestion. It's not rules. It's an integrity test. Come on now, this doesn't pass the integrity test. You shouldn't be raising it in the first place. Hopefully that gives you more money to use for purposes that you're happy to use them for. I'm on the second last page. I'm at the top of the page, 32. There is some language that we are recommending that introduce the notion of civility in terms of mutual respect between councillors. That doesn't mean that there isn't some comment in this regard. We don't necessarily favor the introduction of more harassment language, but we do talk about more positive language in terms of respectful civility and behavior. And so some of that language doesn't hurt to say, it doesn't guarantee or warranty better behavior, but if it's not stated, maybe it does deserve to be stated. So the text around that kind of mutual respect is enhanced in number 32.
Is this not captured in the procedure bylaw as well?
Yes, there's reference to it, but we're talking about some respectful conduct at meetings material that's not covered in the existing language.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? Number 33, public trust is not something that appears often in municipal documents. Public trust is that the public vests in you, an elected councillor, responsibility to act for the betterment of society through the passing of rules and regulations and setting policies in place. The fact that some of that public trust language isn't there in your guidance documents is something that doesn't have to change, but could be included. And so we've suggested some text change, and here we're now talking about specific wording that might occur that does appear in some other codes of conduct that might be appropriate. So what that language specifically is, you'll find on this item. If it's of interest to you and you want to validate it, then certainly that's a possibility. Number 34 simply says you don't have reference to the integrity commissioner in the code. This is you're opting to actually make sure that some reference to the individual and his or her role appears in the material. This came up as a question, I believe, from the regional councillor, so I'll address it at this point. It's number 35 and 36 taken together. Number 35 says, what in law does the law allow us to do if somebody is found to be acting contrary to the code? And the reality is, save for a reprimand and a financial penalty, not very much in law. But in the spirit of the law, many integrity commissioners have defined 6 or 7 or 8 different things that are in the spirit of law that could be recommended to you as counselors. So what those are defined in our research document. One of them has been proven to be ultra vires in one particular case in Toronto, but these are several progressive ways in which you can slap somebody's wrist without necessarily being an inappropriate recommendation. So the decision still is made by you as counsel as to whether or not you accept the recommendation, but it's providing a better reflection of what society might appreciate in terms of, let's call it constructive discipline or constructive sanction. If you want to look at those, they're available in that material.
Regional councillor?
Is there, are we able to, and is there an example of anyone who fully delegates the nature of the penalty to the integrity commissioner?
The short answer is yes. I was one of two in 2 cases. We are not recommending this, but one of the questions in the original framing of the law is, if you've got an independent commissioner, why aren't you charging him or her with the responsibility of actually implementing the recommendation? The problem at current practice, and certainly there is a large urban municipality near us, which I shall not provide a name to, but the problem there is, if the councillor recommends against a particular councillor and also recommends for a different case against the other councillor, what you're seeing is a quid pro quo, not on the basis of the merits of the recommendation, but if you don't accept the integrity commissioner on mine, I won't accept the integrity commissioner's recommendation on yours. So in effect, it flouts the spirit of the legislation by saying we'll trade off things in this area. It also means that if you don't have the integrity commissioner actually implementing the recommendation, then it's a popularity game in effect. You know, is this somebody that I like? Is it somebody that's well referenced, as opposed to somebody I want to hurt? There's lots of arguments in favor of delegating this power to implement to an integrity commissioner. It isn't the law right now, and I want to make it clear that I stand virtually alone among the 30 professionals in this area as wanting that authority delegated. So most of my peers, and I include your incoming integrity commissioner, would not want to have that authority delegated. And certainly there's a case to be made that you're the only elected people, you should make that decision. So it's a long-winded answer by way of saying, in rare cases, municipalities have delegated that authority. It's within their power to do so in law, but it's the exception very much so rather than the rule.
So my only comment to that would be, I don't think it would be appropriate to hire an integrity commissioner and then impose something on them they're not comfortable with, but it'd be interesting to have that conversation to see if it is an option for council to consider.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So,
Yes.
number 36 simply says that in most labor relations and in most understanding of the application of discipline, there is some notion here of progressive discipline, that if somebody is again and again being cited, that there is some notion that the degree or scale of penalty might be increased. This is not something that I think I'm comfortable. Here it appears, I think, as a code of conduct. I think this is something that more properly should be in the ethics question and answer manual. But it is the idea that the spirit of this council, if you accept it, is that you're saying to your integrity commissioner, we understand that progressive practice here is if somebody is doing this for reasons that are not knowledge of the law or it's the first time, that you will exercise some professional discretion on applying your recommendations. So a description of that is covered under number 36. It's just asking for you to move in this area if it's something that you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to appear, I think, in a code of conduct. It's something that perhaps is guidance to your integrity commissioner and would be reflected in his ethics question and answer manual. Number 37, we heard from Phase 2 comments about it's unfortunate that some of the same issues come up again or the same individuals come up again in a closed meeting investigation. There doesn't seem to be any way in the law that we learn from our past mistakes. And there's some brutal comments in here, paraphrasing the comments of one or two of my integrity commissioner colleagues, that there's little to ensure that this process is fair, that there is bloodletting that has been seen in other jurisdictions. We're going to expect, hopefully, to see some legislative change. There isn't anything in law which allows us to be able to say you have to have certain positive fairness consequences to this kind of investigation. So I'm just drawing it to your attention, and if you have any thoughts on this area, that would be the subject to bring it up in. Number 38 is simply saying there is some privacy rights and confidentiality language that could be included. Many municipalities have a responsibility statement that's stronger than yours in terms of confidentiality of information and privacy rights. We're recommending that you think about that, and if you feel it appropriate, we've recommended particular text. I beg your indulgence. We'll do the last three items. There are only three. They're on the last page. Number 39 is we're no longer living in an environment that if there is a code, it's optional whether or not it be signed. The recommendation that we are making to you, and I know not necessarily every councillor is in favor, but we're making it as a recommendation that all organizations, if you've got a code, it needs to be recognized and accepted by the people for whom it applies. And so the idea here would be that the statement be beefed up that currently exists, but it also be understood to be mandatory, that if you're agreeing to serve in the elected role that you have, that you understand the code, that you're available to ask to be educated in the code, and that you understand the purposes and the principles and the content. And to the extent that you can, by signing your name, you're agreeing with the concept and the spirit, and if you want to change the code, you'll do so, but otherwise you recognize that it affects your behavior. Number 40, there is some very interesting language that was proposed by some of your constituents in terms of some creative ways in which community organizations that actually receive funding from the town handle the question about councillors who may appear on their boards or vice versa. I thought it was useful material, and so I'm offering it to you as some text enhancements in corporate policy, and you'll find that in the relevant section in the final detail document. And then the final one, there was not a small amount of comments in Phase 1 about the importance of municipal councillors treating staff with respect and the amount of time that staff may be consuming in order to try and accommodate councillors' requests for information, and when a boundary may be passed between what is good for the town and what is good for the individual councillor. If that is indeed an issue, there is some language that better describes the independence and reporting relationship in an ideal sense to town staff. We are suggesting an expansion of the current text. If you're interested in that, the current text as well as some enhancements are suggested, and you'll find that as the last item. I'm done, Mr. Mayor. I really thank you very much for the time.
We're running very close to the timelines. Thank you for that. Regional Councillor, comments?
One quick question going backwards. It's number 31 in the chart, or number 40 in the new document.
Okay?
In both cases, it's basically saying, policies and rules aren't always the best way, and that sniff test, et cetera. But you list like golf tournaments, fundraising, campaign-related meetings, and charitable events. I'm assuming, or I didn't assume originally, but I'm thinking now maybe, you mean campaign-related meetings to be like fundraising campaign-related meetings? Or
Yes.
do you mean election campaign?
They're both covered, but in different parts of the document.
I know, but right here, what do you mean?
So
Because I think if it's fundraising campaigns, we should state that, because around this world, you see the word campaign, you think elections, and I don't think elections should be governed by sniff test. That should be a clear rule. You cannot.
Okay.
And so if that's not what it meant, like if it didn't mean election, then just clarify it. Yeah. If it does mean election, then I would actually humbly suggest that I agree with everything else, but that should be taken out. That should be clearly delineated as a rule that you cannot do.
So the more important point is not what I'm saying on this text, but what you want to have happen in policy. And you've clearly indicated how you want those two differentiated, and that's exactly what you want to carry through in your discussions in the next couple of weeks. That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, clarification? Awful lot of work's gone into this, and I thank staff for their contributions, as well as members of council for their contributions, knowing that each one of you have been interviewed.
If I might, Mr. Mayor, just one final comment. I don't think you people quite have appreciated how much you've done. I may have done a fair bit of the talking, but you covered virtually every conceivable topic that I would have wanted to raise, so that you not only had a good quality code, but you also addressed a number of educational items and a number of things that are, quite frankly, controversial. And so the fact that we were able to cover this waterfront of activities is a compliment to you. And so I just want you to know you've done a good morning's work, because there's a lot of material here. Now you need to get down to some of the hard stuff of clarifying the particular application of what you like or don't like. But this was a very productive meeting. There's nothing I feel that's left on the table that you haven't been exposed to or have an opportunity to really make this the best quality document for any municipality.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Councillor Kerwin, comments?
Just one comment. I apologize to my colleagues and to you, Dave. I arrived late, but I had two other meetings that were slotted for today, but we moved Monday over to Tuesday, and I had a very difficult time to get out of the, I'm on the board of the seniors meeting place, and I had another meeting prior to that, so I apologize for being late.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have this document in soft copy, because the microfont just doesn't quite work well with me? So if we can get it in soft copy, Andrew, and then maybe if you could let us know what the next steps might be.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will have to connect with David in terms of how exactly we put all the inputs together and the timing around it with regard to decision points, but I think we probably need a couple of steps. Probably one, just to confirm the draft and review it and ensure there's an opportunity for any further questions or clarification, and then a final step in terms of presenting to Committee of the Whole, probably. But I'll connect with David around the timing relative to our council committee schedule.
And if there's any further thoughts from members of council, process would be
yes,
through you, Andrew, or
certainly either through myself or to David directly. The document you have there is very much a working draft, so it is for reference for members of council and our senior staff. So we're you know, at this point, we're keeping that as an internal document. We're not releasing that publicly at this point. The next phase, when we present, we will probably be in a better position to do that.
Okay, thank you. Regional councillors?
So the only thing I'm not clear on there is, so when you present next,
yes,
which will be a draft bylaw, will that, no, it won't, or, sorry.
I have a feeling it'll probably be, I guess you could say it is a draft, but there will be some options.
It'll be a
within
working
that. Still
document with
a working
options.
document,
Okay.
exactly.
That will come to us. Do we know that yet?
I have to establish the time.
Not the time. No, I'm asking what format do you anticipate? Another one like this? Committee of the Whole? Email?
Right. No, it would be in a public forum. I'm not sure whether it would be a Committee of the Whole or a workshop. Probably makes sense at that point to be Committee of the Whole, because some direction can be given.
Okay, yeah, I would say,
Yeah.
I would recommend not part of a regular agenda.
Right, no, a special
it's just gonna be
meeting.
two.
Exactly, I was just talking to the CAO about that, and
And the other possibility is, and I'm sure you were going to do that, but if that sort of working draft were to come to us, give us a week or two, we can sit down, ask questions, email, and
Sure.
maybe get a lot of things clarified before coming into that form.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of ground to cover. Be a lot of ground to
Yeah.
cover. Councillor Pheasants.
I was actually going to sort of suggest a similar thing, because I think that, this is a lot for us to absorb right now. We've each focused on those things that I think, the little nuggets that are of particular interest, but we have to have the time to see it in its entirety and how it all flows together, because, we've addressed the same thing, but over here and over here. So to bring it to a committee of the whole as a next step, I think we still need time to really read through it, digest it, because, as I keep sounding like a broken record now, and this is important to us, because it will formulate sort of our moral guideline as individual councillors and as a council as a whole. So I think it's worthwhile taking the extra time, give us for a next round of input before we bring it back to have to discuss it and provide direction.
Thank you. Okay, any further comments, further questions? I'll take a motion then to adjourn. Councillor Broom-Plumley and Councillor Pheasants. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Very informative. Thank you very much. Very thorough.